Hello, dear students. My name is Samadrita Ma'am, and I am today going to welcome you on behalf of my language and my learning to today's topic, what books and burials tell us. As we know in our history, two things are very important as artifacts of whatever has happened in history and prehistory. So, here in this chapter, we will see how books and burials and several aspects of them tell us about what those periods have to offer us with economically, socially, societal relationships and their religious beliefs. So let's begin. So today's chapter is what books and burials tell us. Two important terms of this chapter are books and burials. The term books refers to the historical books of that time, which is known as the Vedas. This period is belonging to the Rigvedic period. Okay, so in this chapter, we will learn about what the contemporary books of this time, that is the Vedic period, which was usually the arisal period of the Aryans in our country, and what does the burials of that time tell us. Now, at first, we will study about the book section, which means what the books tell us in about our history. So, as we know, there are two periods in history and prehistory. What is history? History, according to its methodological term, tells us about what things have happened before present day when they are recorded as writings. And what is prehistory? Prehistory tells us about such a time in our historic period when there was no writing, which means there is no written records of that time. The three or four ages, that is the Chalcolithic age, the Neolithic age, the Mesolithic age, and the Paleolithic age. These are the four ages which do not have any written documents, which we can decipher and come to know about those during of that time. But from the Rigvedic period, we come across the most important book of that time, that is the Vedas. It is said that the Vedas were composed by the Aryans. Now, who were the Aryans? The Aryans were the one who came to the Indian subcontinent from the northern part, and they settled in India. They usually settled in the northwestern and northern parts of the Indian subcontinent, and they stayed here for a long time. Now, we will come to know about the Vedas, that is the book written by the Aryans. The two pictures that you can see, these are the four books of the Vedas, that is the Rigveda, the Yajurveda, the Samveda, and the Atharva Veda. And these are the few hymns written in the second picture is shows us a few hymns that were written in this Veda. Now, what are the Vedas? The Vedas were the earliest books of Indian history. There are four kinds of Vedas, as we know, that is the Rig Veda, the Samaveda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. So these were the four types of Veda. So these Vedas, each of these Vedas had four different functions. The Rig Veda belonged to the very first period of the Vedic age. Samveda was followed after that, followed by the Yajur Veda, and finally the Atharva Veda. And as we know, the Rig Veda is not written in a form of a story writing or whatever today's writing is. This type of Veda was written in the form of hymns, which means these were written in the form of songs. Now, what were the hymns called? They were called the Sukta, or well said. From the Vedas, we come to know a lot about the religious, social, and economic life of the Aryans who came to stay in India. As we know, each and every period leaves some artifacts with them, some type of sculpture, some type of buildings, or some type of books which tell us about the contemporary period. So similarly, for the Rigvedic period or the period of the Aryans, they left us with the Vedas, which is considered one of the most sacred book of Hindus nowadays. So there were hymns or songs written in the Vedas. Now these hymns were written about many things of this period. They were written usually in the praise of various gods and goddesses, which provide us with a great amount of knowledge about the religious life of the early Aryans. And these hymns, they provided us with a lot of information about the religious, the societal situation, the occupation of the Aryans, and the economic life of the Aryans. That is, what was the main occupation of that time? How was the society divided into several classes? These Vedas were made up of hymns, and these hymns were composed by the priestly class of the Aryans or the rishis, or you can also say the sages. A few of the hymns were also composed by women. And in what language was the Vedas and the hymns written? It was written in the Sanskrit language. Now we will come one by one about what Vedas tell us. The most important thing that the hymns in the Vedas tell us are the information about the gods and goddesses of this period. The most important gods of this period were the Agni, the god of fire. He was the most important god during this period. He was followed by Indra. He was the second important god of the Aryans, the warrior god. And another very important god of the Aryans was known as the god named Soma. It was what? It was basically a plant from which a special drink was prepared. And the priests taught the students, usually belonging to the higher classes of the society, to recite and memorize each and every syllable, word, and sentence of these hymns. Usually, the women were not allowed to learn the Veda, but usually the men, and especially those of the nobility, the kings, they were all taught the hymns of the Vedas. Most of these hymns were composed, taught, and learned by men. So, the first type of the Veda is the Rig Veda. It is the most important type of Veda, so we will broadly read about this Veda in this chapter. Now, the Aryans and the society. The people of this age were known as Aryans during the Rigvedic period. Suppose in the southern part of the continent, the Dravidians were there during this time. So in the northern part of the continent, the people who were dwelling were known as the Aryans. There were two groups of people primarily in the society. That is, the society was divided into mainly two classes. At first, the priests, and the other group was the Rajas. The priests were also known as the Brahmins. What was the work of the Brahmins? They were usually considered as the messenger of gods. So they used to perform many types of rituals for the Rajas. Now, another very important term for the description of the society of this age is the Rajas. The term Raja brings the typical definition of a Raja that we know today, but this was not the type of Raja that they had in the Rigvedic age. The concept of the original king was still developing during this age. So the term Raja was actually an earlier version of it. The Rajas were not the kings as we have seen in the later ages. They did not have the capital cities, palaces, or armies, nor did they collect taxes. They were the sons of families who succeeded their father. So basically, the term king comes from the notion of Rajas. And who were the Rajas? The Rajas were the male section of the family who inherited the head of the family after the death of that head. Two more important words. So we see how the term Raja comes. So two more words that were there as well. to describe the people or the community of the Rigvedic age were the Jana and the Vish. Jana and the Vish, they were basically a group of people belonging to a certain community. Now, these Janas had typical names belonging to the communities. They had names like the Puru Jana and the Bharata Jana, or the Vish. The Janas were also called Vish, the Yadu Jana or Vish, and so on. The Rig Veda was composed in the northwestern part of the Indian continent. So we can easily tell from this that the Rig Vedic period had a very important influence on the preceding generations of the society, because the Rig Veda, it paved the way for the development of certain terms like the Raja, which came to gain a lot of importance in the later medieval period of Indian history, because the term king and rajas were gradually evolving from the Rig Vedic period. Because after this, we will gradually learn how the later on the kings and the Samrat, as we say in contemporary historical term of India, came into being. So the first milestone of the term of the evolving of the king term was placed in the Rigvedic period itself. Now, some important information that we ought to know about the Rigvedic people. Now, the people who compose the hymns, we all know they are known as the Aryans. And similarly, each and every clan or each and every race of people have always have their enemies or opponents. Similarly, the Aryans also had their opponents. They were known as the Dasas or Dashus. These were people. Now we know that the Aryans were people who often used to use certain rituals, and they also used to do Ashwamedh yoga, or there were also various types of rituals they used to do, especially the rajas of the families or the janas or the Vish, for their prosperity. So there were another group of people who did not perform certain rituals. This group of people was known as the Dashus or the Dasas. And they also did not speak the language Sanskrit. And later on, from this term, another very important term came into being, that is the slave. Later on, the term Dasa and the feminine term Dasi came to mean slave. And what happens when the Aryans have enemies? Always they fight with each other, right? So what happens? This is interlinked. The Dasas at first become their opponents, and suppose the Aryans win over the territorial positions of the Dasas, they made them Dasi, which means their slave. So from the term Dasa and Dashus, they became Dasi, which was the term that meant slave. Now these Dashis or the slaves were men and women who were captured in war with the Aryans, who lost the war. And the Aryans captured them and they treated them like the property of theirs or their slave. And they used to torture them and oppress them, and also used to make them do their work or in their household or whatever they wanted to do. The next important topic of this chapter is agriculture and other aspects of the Rigvedic period. There were many prayers in the Rigvedic period for cattle, children, and horses. Now, few important aspects of the agriculture and the other aspects of this period always involve the term wealth. Here we will see what wealth was, or what the definition of wealth was for these people. For example, nowadays what we see people fighting for money, or in the later medieval age we also saw people fighting for lands, to conquer territory, to conquer their wealth, and to conquer each other's army, each other's navy. But another very striking feature of the Rigvedic period was this, that the Rigvedic period saw the Aryans fighting with each other for their cattle. Very important to note is that The cattle was considered as the primary source of wealth for the Rigvedic people. So the main source of wealth was considered as the cattle. The more amount of cattle a clan or a jana had, the more richer that clan or the jana or the wish was considered. And the second important thing for which they used to fight was land, which was important for growing crops and also for using them as pasture, which were again interlinked with that cattle because cattle was fed with that pasture of that land. So as we see, the main wealth of the people of this Rigvedic period were connected to the cattle only. The other things that were fought for were also relating to the betterment of the cattle. For example, they were also fighting, they have also been seen to fight for rivers and for water bodies because the water bodies are also required to maintain a good pasture of land and also to capture people because they wanted to treat them as slaves. So here we see in the wars that were fought for by the Aryans were mainly for cattle. The cattle was the main source of wealth for the Aryans, and every battle had something interlinked with the cattle to do. Everything was concentrated for the betterment of the cattle, and the more and more cattle a raja or a jana owned, the more richer that raja or the jana or every section of the society was considered. But the slaves, that is the dashas or dashis that the Aryans used to win, they were not allowed to perform in any war or any respected situation of the society because they were treated as slaves. And the Brahmins of this age, they always enjoyed certain privileges from birth because they were considered as the messengers of God. Now we come to another very important topic, which is the most important language of the Vedic age, which was Sanskrit. Now, Sanskrit is considered as a part of a family of languages which are called the Indo-European languages. Now, this Indo-European language is a very broad term. It is made up of three types of languages. One is Indian, Asian, and European language. Now, Indian language, Asian language, and European language together form Indo-European language. Now, these three subparts also have more languages with them. For example, the Indian language, which were part of the Indo-European languages, were Assamese, Gujarati, Hindi, Kashmiri, and Sindhi. The Asian languages that were part of the family of languages of the Indo-European were Persian. And there were also many European languages such as English, French, German, Greek, Italian, and Spanish. So all these languages comprise the three sections of the Indo-European languages, that is the Indian, Asian, and European, which in turn give rise to the Indo-European languages. So Sanskrit was a part of this family of languages. Because now, why are they called a family of language? Because it is said that certain words of these languages had interlinked or interconnection between themselves in their pronunciation and also in their meanings. For example, if we take the word matter in Sanskrit, it means mother. Similarly, in Hindi, the word ma means mother, and also in the language English, the term mother means ma. So we can see that all the three different languages have the basic pronunciation of ma in them. So this is how Sanskrit is said to have connection to these Indo-European languages. Now, as we know, the Aryans had settled in the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent. So we also ought to know what were the other types of languages which were prevalent in the other parts of the Indian subcontinent. That is the southern part, the northeastern part, and the other parts of India, and also the eastern parts. For example, In the southern part of the Indian subcontinent, the Dravidian language was very important. As you can see in the map that I have drawn, that was considered as the Indo-European languages of that contemporary period. And this is the orange marked portion is the geographically determined Indian position during this period. So we know that during this period, the Sanskrit was the term which was the language which was prevalent in the northwestern part. Similarly, in the southern part, the Dravidian language was very much popular. And the languages that there were also several languages spoken in the Jharkhand and parts of central India. They belong to another group of family which is known as the Austroasiatic family. And in the northeastern part, the Tibeto-Burman family of languages was the most predominant part of their speech. And now we come to some other important topics of this period. Now we will know the most important rivers of the Vedic period. The most important rivers of this, there was few important rivers during those times which no longer have their existence. One was Saraswati. It is considered that the second important river was Saraswati, which is said to have been there during the Rigvedic period, but now it has no trace, or it might have dried up or become extinct. But the most important type of river during the Rigvedic period was the Indus. So the most important river was Indus. The second most important river was Saraswati, which has no more any existence. The third and the less important river was the Ganga and the Yamuna. Why were they considered less important? Because they were mentioned for only once during the Rigvedic period. Now, if we are asked few important questions on Rigveda, we can be asked these questions. If we say, name some important rivers of the Rigvedic age, we can say that Indus and Saraswati, these are the two most important rivers of the Vedic age. Names, if we are asked that name some important gods of the Rigvedic age, then we should say Agni, Indra, the warrior god, and Agni, the god of fire. When were the Vedas composed? The Vedas were composed 3,500 years ago. Who wrote the hymns of the Rigveda? The rishis or the sages. And now, who were the rajas? The rajas were the male head of the families who succeeded their fathers. It was the earlier version of what a king is called in the later ages. Now, what is a jana or a wish? A jana or a wish is a group of people or a community in the Rigvedic society. You can give some examples like the Puru Jana or the Bharat Jana. From there only the Mahabharata has been composed, because the characters of the Mahabharata are considered as the Aryans. It is said that Maharaja Bharat was the first king who belonged to the Aryan race. This is an extra information that I'm giving you. Who were the Brahmins? The Brahmins were the priestly class of the Rigvedic age. And what were their functions? They used to perform certain rituals for the rajas. For what reasons were the battles fought in the Vedic age? Here you will write sequentially. The most important reason was what? The cattle. Then followed by the land, water body, and lastly, pasture. So these are the 8 important questions that usually we get from the Vedic age. Next, we come to the silent sentinels. Now, what were the silent sentinels? Who were the silent sentinels? What does the term sentinel mean? We will know in this chapter. First, let's talk about a little bit about megalith. The literal meaning of megalith is a big stone or a stone boulder. Now, Why did these stone boulders all of a sudden become so important in our history? Because these stone boulders tell us a lot about what is under them, that is, the dead bodies, which in turn are called burials, which is another most pivotal topic of this chapter. So these burials, they were covered with big stones known as megaliths. Now, how were these megaliths placed on the dead bodies of the people who were buried under these megaliths? They were arranged by the people of this age to mark the burial sites. The practice of erecting megaliths began about how many years ago? 3000 years ago, and was prevalent throughout the Deccan Plateau and also southern part of the Indian subcontinent, also in the northeast and in Kashmir. In February 2021, which means this year, a news article of the Hindu was in a news article of Hindu, there was a mention of pillar of blood or Netteru Stambham. It is an 11-foot high menhir in Telangana. It is a kind of a megalith. It is now there are several types of megaliths. We will learn about them in the next slide. So, what were these megaliths? Why were these megaliths important, or what special features did they have? Some megaliths were seen over the ground, as we can see in these two pictures. There are few megaliths over the ground, and some megaliths are also found under the ground. In the second picture, I can tell you that in the base there are few more megaliths which are just being seen partially. Sometimes the archaeologists find a circle of stone boulders or a single large stone standing on the ground. These mean that there are burials between them or beneath them. One megalith and other megalith are also the signifier that between two burials, megaliths were also placed so that one type of burial could be differentiated from the other. So this was basically the introductory part of what megaliths are. If we want some more information of megaliths, what do we know from them? How were these large boulders placed on a dead body? How were they able to bring them and place them with such perfection over the burials? Now, the people of this age, they used to follow a certain rule. At first, what did they do? At first, they found suitable stones. Then they transported these stones to the burial sites, which means the place where they used to bury their dead. After that, they digged pits in the earth or the soil. Then what did they do? Then they used to shape the stones. You can see they used to give it a sort of an oval kind of shape so that they can be placed properly and they do not fall down due to abrupt shaping. Then what did they do? They had to shape the stones. After that, they buried the dead, and lastly, they placed the stones in position that is just above the burial. So this is how the megaliths were placed over the burials. Thank you. So in this chapter, what did we learn? In this chapter, we learned about two basic pillars of information that history has to offer. One is the megaliths, that is the boulders which tell us about the burials beneath them. And after excavating the places under these megaliths or the stone boulders, we will be able to know a lot about the dead bodies or their contemporary times. So one of the most important feature of megalith was that the dead bodies that were buried under them, they were placed intactically without being confused with other dead bodies. Often shapes of certain animals and also certain birds were given to give a distinctive feature to a certain kind of grave by placing a type of megalith above it. And another very important thing that we have learned in this chapter is that the Vedas, as in the Rigveda. From the Rigvedas, we come to know about the contemporary societal religious situation of the society and also to some extent the occupation of the people. And what do they tell us? The most important reason for battles, the performance or the functioning of the major sections of the society, that is the priests, the rajas, and also a bit about the slaves. So from here we come to know about the basics of the society of the Aryans. Thank you. I hope you have enjoyed this chapter.